The letter trembled in Dorothy Miller's hand as the stagecoach rumbled across the rugged terrain of Colorado Territory, 1873. She read it for perhaps the 100th time since leaving Boston 3 weeks ago. Seeking bride of good character and sturdy constitution. Land and cattle aplenty. Respectfully, Jake Forrester, Willow Creek. Those sparse words represented her last hope, her only hope after her parents' deaths left her penniless and alone at 22. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, jolting Dorothy from her thoughts. Outside the window, a dusty main street stretched before her, lined with wooden buildings. Willow Creek, her future. Last stop, the driver called, opening the door. Willow Creek. Dorothy clutched her small carpetbag and stepped down into the bright sunlight. The journey had been grueling. Her body ached, and dust clung to every inch of her once fine traveling dress. She'd sold most of her possessions to pay for passage west, keeping only a few treasured books, her mother's silver hairbrush, and enough clothes to start her new life. She stood uncertainly on the wooden walkway, searching the small crowd for someone who might be Mr. Forrester. Her heart pounded. What would he be like? His letters had been brief but polite. Would he be kind? She'd heard stories of mail-order brides arriving to find men nothing like their letters suggested. Miss Miller. Dorothy turned to face a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. His eyes were a startling blue beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. Not handsome in the refined way of Boston gentlemen, but striking in a rugged frontier way. "Yes," she replied, lifting her chin despite her nervousness. "I'm Dorothy Miller, Jake Forrester." He tipped his hat, studying her with an unreadable expression. "Welcome to Willow Creek." His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, with a slight drawl that marked him as different from the men she'd known back east. He made no move to take her hand, and Dorothy felt a flicker of uncertainty. Had he expected someone different? Someone prettier, perhaps, or sturdier looking? "Thank you, Mr. Forrester. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." She tried to sound confident despite the dust on her clothes and the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Jake nodded, taking her carpetbag. "Got anything else?" "No, this is all I have." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. Dorothy felt her cheeks flush. Did he think she'd bring a dowry? She'd been clear in her letters that she had little to offer beyond herself and her willingness to work. "Wagons this way," he said, turning and heading down the street. Dorothy followed, trying to keep pace with his long strides. The town was smaller than she'd expected, but bustling with activity. Men in dusty clothes and women in practical dresses moved purposefully along the boardwalks. A few curious glances came her way, but most people seemed occupied with their own business. Jake's wagon was simple but sturdy, hitched to two strong-looking horses. He helped her climb onto the wooden seat before settling beside her, giving her a respectful distance that both relieved and slightly disappointed her. What had she expected? That he would sweep her into his arms like the heroes in penny novels. "Ranch is about an hour's ride," he said, flicking the reins. The horses moved forward, and Dorothy gripped the edge of the seat as they left the relative smoothness of the town street for the rutted dirt road beyond. "Is it far from town?" she asked, trying to make conversation. "Far enough." "Good grazing land, though. Got 100 head of cattle and room to expand." Pride tinged his voice, and Dorothy felt a small surge of hope. At least he seemed to be a man of some substance, as his letter had suggested. Not wealthy by Boston standards, perhaps, but established. And "Is it just you at the ranch?" She'd wondered about this. His letters hadn't mentioned family. Jake kept his eyes on the road. "My brother Daniel helps out. He's got a place about a mile over, and there's Hank works the cattle with me. Got a cook too, Mrs. Pearson. She comes in days." "I see." Dorothy tried to picture this small household. "I'm a fair cook myself. I could take over those duties if you prefer." Jake glanced at her, then back at the road. "We'll see. You might want to rest a spell first. Long journey from Boston." The consideration surprised her. She'd expected to be put to work immediately, proving her worth. "Thank you, but I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Forrester." "Jake," he corrected. "Folks just call me Jake out here." "Jake," she repeated, the familiar address feeling strange on her tongue after the formalities of Boston society. "And you may call me Dorothy." He nodded but said nothing more. The wagon rumbled on, and Dorothy turned her attention to the landscape. Unlike the crowded, bustling streets of Boston or the cultivated countryside of Massachusetts, this was wild country. Rolling hills stretched to distant mountains, covered with grass that rippled like water in the breeze. Occasional stands of trees marked the courses of streams. The vastness of it took her breath away. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Jake looked at her with surprise. "Most Easterners don't see it that way at first, usually talk about how empty it is." "It's not empty," Dorothy replied. "It's free." The word came unbidden, but it felt right. Free from the constraints and judgments of Boston society, where a woman without family or fortune had few options. Something in Jake's expression softened slightly. "Guess it is, at that." The hour passed mostly in silence, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as Dorothy had feared. There was something calming about Jake's steady presence beside her, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the endless sky above. Finally, they crested a rise, and Jake pointed. "There it is, Forrester Ranch." Dorothy leaned forward eagerly. Below them lay a small valley with a creek winding through it. Near the water stood a log house, larger than she'd expected, with a covered porch across the front. Nearby were a barn, corral, and several smaller outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "You built all this?" she asked, impressed. "Started with just the cabin 10 years ago," Jake said. "Added on bit by bit. Land was cheap then if you were willing to work it." As they drew closer, Dorothy could see that while not luxurious, the place was well maintained. The house had glass windows, a rarity in many frontier homes she'd heard about. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and flowers grew in a small garden by the porch. Someone had taken care to make this more than just a shelter. A woman stepped onto the porch as they approached, stout and gray-haired, wiping her hands on an apron. This must be Mrs. Pearson, the cook Jake had mentioned. Jake halted the wagon in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help Dorothy. His hands were strong and calloused as they circled her waist, lifting her easily to the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that she quickly dismissed as mere gratitude for the assistance. "Mrs. Pearson, this is Miss Miller," Jake said as the older woman approached. "Dorothy, this is Mrs. Pearson." "Welcome to Willow Creek, miss," Mrs. Pearson said, her weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "You must be exhausted from your journey. I've got supper nearly ready and your room prepared." "Thank you," Dorothy said, touched by the welcome. "I appreciate your kindness." "Nonsense, child. Been telling Mr. Forrester here for years he needs a woman's touch around the place." She gave Jake a meaningful look that made him shift uncomfortably. "Let's get you settled," Jake said, retrieving Dorothy's bag from the wagon. "Then you can rest before supper." The interior of the house surprised Dorothy. She'd expected a rough bachelor's quarters, but while simple, the main room was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable-looking chairs before it. Bookshelves held a surprising number of volumes. A solid table with chairs stood in the dining area, and the kitchen beyond gleamed with well-cared-for implements. "This is lovely," Dorothy said honestly. Jake looked pleased despite himself. "Through here," he said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a small but pleasant bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, and a small dresser. A braided rug covered part of the wooden floor, and curtains framed the window. "Mrs. Pearson fixed it up," Jake explained, setting down her bag. "Said a lady would want things nice." "It's perfect," Dorothy said, feeling tears threaten unexpectedly. After weeks of travel and years of uncertainty before that, having a space of her own felt like an unimaginable luxury. Jake cleared his throat. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's in an hour." When he'd gone, Dorothy sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. What had she done, traveling thousands of miles to marry a stranger? Jake seemed decent enough, but she knew nothing about him. Would he be kind? Would he ever care for her, or was this purely a practical arrangement in his mind? She thought of the young man who'd courted her in Boston before her parents died, how quickly he'd disappeared when her circumstances changed. Love, she'd learned, was a luxury for those with security. She couldn't expect it here. At best, she hoped for respect and fair treatment. Sighing, Dorothy stood and moved to the washstand. She poured water from the pitcher into the bowl and washed away the dust of travel as best she could. From her bag, she took out her second dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean. She changed quickly, brushed her light brown hair and secured it in a neat bun, then squared her shoulders. Whatever happened, she would face it with dignity. She was Dorothy Miller, and she'd survived worse than an uncertain marriage to a quiet rancher. When she emerged for supper, Jake was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He turned at her entrance and something flickered in his eyes that Dorothy couldn't interpret. "Feel better?" he asked. "Much, thank you." She smoothed her skirt self-consciously. "I'm afraid I don't have many clothes. I had to sell most of my things before leaving Boston." Jake frowned slightly. "We can get you what you need in town. There's a dry goods store." Before Dorothy could respond, Mrs. Pearson called them to the table. The meal was simple but hearty: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh baked bread that made Dorothy's mouth water. She realized how long it had been since she'd had a proper home-cooked meal. They ate mostly in silence at first, until Mrs. Pearson began asking Dorothy about her journey west. The older woman's friendly questions drew her out, and soon Dorothy found herself talking more than she had in weeks, describing the changing landscapes she'd seen and the colorful characters she'd met on the stage coaches. Jake said little, but he listened attentively, watching Dorothy with those intense blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Occasionally, he'd ask a question that showed he was following her story, surprising her with his interest in details she'd thought insignificant. "Well, Mrs. Pearson said as she served apple pie for dessert, "sounds like you're made of sterner stuff than most Eastern ladies we hear about. That'll serve you well out here." "I hope so," Dorothy replied. "I'm willing to learn whatever I need to. Jake's a good teacher, Mrs. Pearson said with a sidelong glance at him. "Patient, too, which is rare enough in men." Jake shifted in his chair. "Mrs. Pearson exaggerates." "I do not," the older woman retorted. "Taught your brother Daniel everything he knows about ranching, didn't you? And he was as green as spring grass when he arrived." A small smile touched Jake's lips. "Daniel's a quick study." After supper, Mrs. Pearson departed for her own small house in town, leaving Dorothy and Jake alone. An awkward silence fell between them as they sat in the chairs by the fireplace. Outside, the sky had darkened to deep blue, and stars were beginning to appear. "Mrs. Pearson seems kind," Dorothy ventured. "She is. Been with me since I built the place." "Widowed in '63, husband was in the Union Army." Dorothy nodded. The war had left many widows back east as well. You mentioned your brother Daniel. Did he come west with you? Jake shook his head. Came later, after the war. He was just a kid when I left home. And where was home? Pennsylvania. Farm country. Jake poked at the fire with an iron. Left at 16. Wanted something different. Dorothy hesitated, then asked, and your parents? Gone. Pa first, then Ma a few years later. His voice held old pain, and Dorothy instinctively understood not to press. I'm sorry. Mine are gone too. My father last winter and my mother this spring. Jake looked at her directly. That's why you answered my advertisement. Dorothy saw no point in pretending. Yes, I had no other family, no inheritance to speak of. The alternatives were. She trailed off, thinking of the limited options for a woman in her position: becoming a governess if she was lucky, or factory work if she wasn't, or depending on distant relatives' charity, which came with its own price. I understand, Jake said quietly. No need to explain. The simple acceptance in his voice touched her more than elaborate sympathy would have. Thank you. Another silence fell, but it felt less strained now. Dorothy gathered her courage to address what they'd both been avoiding. Mr. Forrester, Jake, I know we've corresponded about arrangements, but I think we should discuss expectations. For our marriage, Jake's expression became guarded. What did you want to know? When did you envision the ceremony taking place? Dorothy asked practically. And are there things I should know about your preferences for running a household? Jake seemed surprised by her directness. Reverend Simmons comes through town every other Sunday. He'll be here this weekend if that suits you. He paused. As for the household, Mrs. Pearson's shown you most of it. I don't have particular demands, just ordinary meals and a clean house. I'm gone working most days until evening. Dorothy nodded, relieved by his reasonable expectations. That seems fair. I should tell you I'm not experienced with ranch life, but I'm a quick learner. And I can cook and manage accounts if needed. Accounts? Jake raised an eyebrow. My father was a merchant. I helped with his books. It was one of the few useful skills she'd brought west. Jake considered this. That could be helpful. Been keeping my own, but numbers aren't my strong suit. I'd be happy to assist, Dorothy offered. Jake studied her for a long moment. Miss Miller, Dorothy, I want to be clear about something. This arrangement is practical on both our parts, but I won't rush you into anything. We can wait on the ceremony if you need more time. The consideration touched her. That's very kind, but I see no reason to delay. We both know why I'm here. She met his gaze steadily. I will be a good wife to you, Mr. Forrester. I keep my promises. Something like respect flickered in Jake's eyes. As do I. Dorothy nodded, a strange mixture of relief and nervousness washing over her. In 5 days she would be Mrs. Jake Forrester. The reality of it suddenly seemed overwhelming. Jake must have noticed her expression. It's been a long day for you. Should turn in, get some rest. Yes, I think that's wise. She rose, smoothing her skirts. Good night, then. Jake stood as well, towering over her. Good night, Dorothy. In her room, Dorothy changed into her nightgown and slipped between the cool sheets of her new bed. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast western sky, more than she'd ever seen in Boston. Everything here was bigger, wilder, more open, including her future. For better or worse, this was her life now. A practical marriage to a quiet rancher in a land far from everything she'd known. She would make it work. She had to. Dorothy closed her eyes, too exhausted to worry further, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next few days passed in a whirl of activity as Dorothy familiarized herself with the ranch and its routines. Jake was gone most days from dawn until evening, working with the cattle or mending fences with Hank, the ranch hand who lived in a small cabin near the barn. Hank was older than Jake, with a grizzled beard and a talent for telling outlandish stories that Dorothy suspected were mostly fabrication. Mrs. Pearson came each morning to cook and clean, but she encouraged Dorothy to work alongside her, teaching her the peculiarities of cooking on a wood stove and the best ways to preserve food for the coming winter. "He's a good man," Mrs. Pearson told her on the third day as they kneaded bread dough together. "Quiet, mind you, and keeps his thoughts to himself too much, but decent to the core." "Has he been alone long?" Dorothy asked, curious about the man she was to marry. Mrs. Pearson's hand stilled momentarily. "There was a girl in town he courted a few years back, Sarah Jennings. Pretty little thing, daughter of the mercantile owner, but she chose to marry a banker from Denver instead." She resumed kneading. "Jake never spoke of it, but it hit him hard. Hasn't shown interest in anyone since, till he wrote for you." Dorothy absorbed this information silently. So Jake had known heartbreak too. Perhaps that explained his reserved manner and practical approach to marriage. Like her, he'd learned that love was unreliable. In the evenings, they would eat supper together, sometimes joined by Hank or by Jake's brother Daniel, who proved to be a younger, more talkative version of Jake with the same striking blue eyes but a ready smile that his older brother lacked. Daniel's obvious admiration for his brother touched Dorothy, as did the way Jake listened patiently to Daniel's enthusiastic plans for his own small ranch. After the meal, Jake and Dorothy would sit by the fire, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes talking quietly. Dorothy learned that Jake had fought briefly for the Union before heading west, that he'd worked as a trapper and trail guide before settling in Willow Creek, that he read extensively during the long winter months when ranch work slowed. For his part, Jake seemed genuinely interested in Dorothy's stories of Boston, asking thoughtful questions about the city and her life there. She found herself telling him about her father's business failures and eventual death from pneumonia, her mother's decline afterward, and the desperate straits that had led her to answer his advertisement. "You're brave," he said simply one evening, surprising her. Dorothy shook her head. "Not brave, just practical. There weren't many choices left. Many would have taken easier paths than traveling alone across the country to marry a stranger," Jake countered. "That takes courage." The praise warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you. Though I'm not sure what other easier paths you imagine were available." Jake's expression darkened slightly. "I've been to cities. I know what happens to women without protection or means." Dorothy nodded, acknowledging the grim reality. "Yes. Well, as I said, practical, not brave." On the day before the wedding, Jake surprised her by suggesting they ride into town. "Need to get you a ring," he explained gruffly, "and thought you might want some fabric or such, for new clothes." Dorothy had been making do with her two dresses, washing one while wearing the other. The prospect of new clothing was tempting, but she was conscious of cost. "That's very kind, but please don't feel obligated to spend more than is comfortable." Jake gave her a look that bordered on exasperation. "Wouldn't offer if I couldn't afford it. Ranch is doing well enough." They rode in the wagon, with Dorothy wearing her best dress, a faded green cotton that had once been quite fashionable in Boston. The journey seemed shorter now that she was familiar with the landscape, and Dorothy found herself enjoying the bright morning and Jake's steady presence beside her. Willow Creek looked different through the lens of almost belonging. People nodded to Jake as they passed, many calling greetings or stopping to be introduced to Dorothy. She was struck by the respect with which everyone treated him. Their first stop was the general store, a large wooden building with a wide porch. Inside, shelves were stacked with everything from tools to fabric to canned goods. A balding man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Jake, good to see you, and this must be your bride-to-be." He came forward, hand extended. "Howard Jenkins, Miss Miller, welcome to Willow Creek." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." Dorothy shook his hand. "Dorothy needs some fabric for dresses," Jake said, "and whatever else ladies require." Mr. Jenkins smiled. "My wife can help with that, Martha." He called toward the back of the store. "Come meet Jake Forrester's fiancée." A plump woman with kind eyes emerged from behind a curtain and immediately took Dorothy under her wing, showing her bolts of calico muslin and even a lovely blue wool that would make a fine winter dress. Dorothy selected carefully, mindful of practicality but unable to resist the blue wool and a pretty floral print that reminded her of her mother's garden. Mrs. Jenkins also helped her choose thread, buttons, and other notions, as well as a sturdy pair of boots better suited to ranch life than her city shoes. Jake paid for everything without comment, though Dorothy noticed him adding ledgers and pencils to the order when he thought she wasn't looking. Their next stop was the jeweler, a small shop where a German immigrant named Mr. Hoffman showed them a selection of simple gold bands. Jake let Dorothy choose, and she selected the plainest one, not wanting to be extravagant. "You sure?" Jake asked, brow furrowed. "Could get one with some decoration." "This is perfect," Dorothy assured him. She'd never been one for ostentatious jewelry anyway. As they left the jeweler's, a young woman approached them on the boardwalk. She was strikingly pretty, with golden hair and a fashionable dress that immediately made Dorothy conscious of her own faded attire. "Jake Forrester," the woman said, her voice sweet but with an edge Dorothy couldn't quite place. "I heard you were getting married." Her gaze swept over Dorothy with barely concealed assessment. Jake's posture stiffened slightly. "Miss Jennings." "Yes, this is Dorothy Miller." "Dorothy, this is Sarah Jennings, Mrs. Harrison now." "Ah," the woman who had rejected Jake for a Denver banker. Dorothy extended her hand politely. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Harrison." Sarah took her hand briefly. "Likewise. What a surprise to hear Jake was sending for a bride. After all, he always seemed so self-sufficient." The words held a subtle barb. "Sometimes a man realizes what he's missing," Jake said evenly. "How's Denver treating you?" Sarah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wonderfully. Thomas is doing extremely well at the bank. We have a lovely home." She turned to Dorothy. "And where are you from, Miss Miller?" "Boston," Dorothy replied, matching Sarah's polite tone. "Though I'm finding I prefer the openness of the West." "How interesting. It can be quite an adjustment for those used to civilization." Sarah's emphasis on the last word was slight but unmistakable. Dorothy smiled. "Indeed. But I've always found that true civilization lies in how people treat one another, not in external trappings." Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. "We should be moving along. Good to see you, Mrs. Harrison. Of course. Best wishes for tomorrow." Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you'll be very content together." As they walked away, Dorothy felt Jake's tension beside her. "She seems pleasant," Dorothy offered diplomatically. Jake snorted. "She seems exactly what she is." He glanced at Dorothy. "Sorry about that." "No need to apologize. I've encountered her type in Boston drawing rooms." Dorothy hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Pearson mentioned you two had been acquainted." Jake's jaw tightened. Ancient history. They completed their errands in companionable silence, stopping at the small restaurant for lunch before heading back to the ranch. As they ate, Dorothy noticed several people watching them with curious interest. "I feel rather like an exhibit at a museum," she murmured to Jake. He grimaced. "Small town, not much happens here. A wedding is big news." "Will many people attend tomorrow?" Dorothy asked, suddenly nervous. "Just Daniel, Mrs. Pearson, Hank, and Reverend Simmons, unless you want more. Could invite some townsfolk." "No," Dorothy said quickly. "Small sounds perfect." The idea of facing a crowd of strangers on what would already be a nerve-wracking day held no appeal. Jake nodded, looking relieved. Good. Never cared for big gatherings myself. The ride home was pleasant, with Jake pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the early days of his ranch. Dorothy found herself laughing at his dry descriptions of his first disastrous attempts at cattle ranching. "You really had no experience with cattle before coming west?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "None. Grew up with crops, not livestock. First winter, lost half my small herd because I didn't know to provide enough hay. Second winter, almost lost the rest because I didn't recognize the signs of a blizzard coming." He shrugged. "Learn by doing, sometimes the hard way." "That takes courage," Dorothy said, deliberately echoing his earlier words to her. Jake glanced at her, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "Just stubborn, maybe." Back at the ranch, Mrs. Pearson had prepared a special supper for their last evening before becoming husband and wife. Daniel joined them, bringing a bottle of good whiskey to mark the occasion. "To my brother Jake," Daniel toasted, raising his glass, "who finally came to his senses and realized a man needs more than cattle for company." Jake rolled his eyes but raised his glass. "And to Dorothy," he added quietly, "for taking a chance on a stranger." Dorothy felt her cheeks warm as they all drank. The small gesture of acknowledgement touched her deeply. After supper, Daniel took his leave, reminding them he'd return for the ceremony the next day. Mrs. Pearson stayed to clean up, shooing Dorothy away when she tried to help. "Not the night before your wedding, child. Go rest. Tomorrow's an important day." Dorothy found Jake on the porch, looking out at the darkening landscape. She hesitated, then joined him, keeping a respectable distance between them as they leaned on the railing. "Having second thoughts?" Jake asked without looking at her. The question surprised her. "No, are you?" He shook his head. "Just wanted to make sure it's not too late to change your mind." Dorothy considered her response carefully. "I made my decision when I boarded that first stagecoach in Boston. I'm not one to turn back." She paused. "Unless you're having doubts." Jake finally looked at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "No, I think we'll suit well enough." It wasn't a romantic declaration, but Dorothy hadn't expected one. "Yes, I believe we will." They stood in silence for a few minutes more, watching the first stars appear. "Thank you for today," Dorothy said eventually. "For the fabric and everything." Jake nodded. "Needed doing." Another silence, but not uncomfortable. "I should turn in," Dorothy said at last. "As Mrs. Pearson said, tomorrow's an important day." Jake straightened. "Yes, sleep well, Dorothy. You too, Jake." In her room, Dorothy carefully laid out her green dress for the morning, then slipped into her nightgown. She sat on the edge of the bed, thoughts swirling. By this time tomorrow, she would be Mrs. Jake Forrester. The idea still seemed surreal. She didn't love Jake, of course. She hardly knew him. But she respected him, and she believed he respected her. Perhaps that was enough. Many marriages, even among the wealthy in Boston, were built on less. Dorothy slept fitfully, waking several times during the night. When morning finally came, she rose early, washing thoroughly before donning her best dress. She arranged her hair carefully, wishing she had flowers or ribbons to brighten her appearance. As a concession to vanity, she pinched her cheeks to bring color to them and bit her lips to redden them slightly. A knock at her door startled her. "Dorothy," Mrs. Pearson called. "I've brought something for you." Dorothy opened the door to find the older woman holding a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. "Every bride should have flowers," Mrs. Pearson said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "These grow by the creek. Not fancy, but pretty." "They're beautiful," Dorothy said sincerely, taking the small bouquet. "Thank you, Mrs. Pearson." Jake's waiting in the main room, Reverend Simmons arrived early. She patted Dorothy's arm. "You look lovely, dear. Jake's a fortunate man, whether he knows it yet or not." Dorothy took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and followed Mrs. Pearson to the main room where Jake, Daniel, Hank, and a thin man in a black coat she assumed was Reverend Simmons waited. Jake turned as she entered, and for a moment, his usual impassive expression gave way to something that looked almost like wonder. He was dressed in what was clearly his best: a clean white shirt, dark vest, and black pants that had been carefully pressed. His hair was neatly combed and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw usually hidden by stubble. "You look beautiful," he said quietly as she approached. "Thank you," Dorothy replied, touched by the compliment. "You look very handsome yourself." The ceremony was brief but dignified, with Reverend Simmons leading them through the traditional vows. Dorothy spoke clearly, making each promise with sincere intent to honor it. Jake's responses were equally firm, his blue eyes never leaving hers as he pledged his troth. When it came time for the ring, Jake's large hands were surprisingly gentle as he slipped the gold band onto her finger. His own hand was steady as she placed a matching band on his finger, a purchase he'd made without telling her, apparently wanting to wear a symbol of their union as well. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Simmons declared. "You may kiss your bride." This was the moment Dorothy had been both anticipating and dreading. She and Jake hadn't discussed this aspect of their arrangement, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Jake hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips. It lasted just a moment, but Dorothy felt a surprising warmth spread through her at the contact. When he pulled back, something in his eyes had softened. Daniel broke the moment with enthusiastic congratulations, pumping his brother's hand and kissing Dorothy's cheek. Hank followed with his good wishes, and Mrs. Pearson enfolded Dorothy in a motherly hug. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Forrester," the older woman whispered. "Mrs. Forrester." Dorothy was now Mrs. Forrester. The reality of it washed over her as they moved to the table where Mrs. Pearson had prepared a wedding breakfast. She was married. She had a home, a husband, a place in the world again. The meal was festive, with Daniel telling stories that made even Jake laugh, and Reverend Simmons offering gentle wisdom about marriage before he had to leave for another appointment in a neighboring settlement. Mrs. Pearson had outdone herself with the food, preparing pancakes with maple syrup, eggs, bacon, and fresh bread that made the simple ranch house feel like a celebration hall. After the meal, when the guests had departed, Mrs. Pearson, with the promise to return in a few days, giving the newlyweds time alone, Dorothy found herself suddenly nervous. She and Jake were truly alone together for the first time as husband and wife. Jake seemed to sense her anxiety. "Thought we might ride out, see some of the ranch," he suggested. "If you're not too tired." Relieved at the prospect of postponing more intimate matters, Dorothy agreed readily. "I'd like that very much." Jake saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare he'd acquired specifically for Dorothy, anticipating that she'd need to learn to ride to manage life on the ranch. Dorothy changed into her new, sturdier boots and a slightly older dress that could withstand horseback riding. Jake was patient as he taught her the basics of mounting and controlling the horse. Dorothy was a quick study, though her legs protested the unfamiliar position. Soon they were riding across the ranch, with Jake pointing out landmarks and explaining his operations. "Creek never runs dry, even in August," he told her, gesturing to the water that cut through their property. "That's rare and valuable out here." They rode to a rise that overlooked the entire ranch, the house and outbuildings below, the grazing cattle, the distant mountains. "It's magnificent," Dorothy said sincerely. "You've built something remarkable here, Jake." He looked pleased at her praise. "Started with nothing but the land. Been adding bit by bit." "What do you hope for next?" Dorothy asked, genuinely curious about his ambitions. Jake considered the question seriously. "More cattle, better bloodlines to improve the herd, maybe expand the house someday." He glanced at her. "What about you? What do you hope for?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her hopes in a long time. "Stability, I suppose. A place to belong." She hesitated, then added more softly, "Perhaps someday children." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That seems reasonable." They rode in companionable silence for a while longer before returning to the house. The afternoon passed quietly, with Dorothy organizing her new sewing supplies and Jake attending to some small repairs around the property. As evening approached, Dorothy realized she should prepare supper, her first meal as mistress of the household. She was nervous but determined to make it a success. Jake had a well-stocked pantry thanks to Mrs. Pearson, and Dorothy set about making a hearty stew with the ingredients available. Jake came in as she was setting the table, stopping to wash his hands at the basin by the door. "Smells good," he said appreciatively. "I hope you'll enjoy it," Dorothy replied. "I'm still learning my way around your kitchen." "Our kitchen," Jake corrected gently. Dorothy smiled. "Yes, our kitchen." They ate together, talking about the day and plans for the coming week. Jake mentioned needing to ride to a neighboring ranch to discuss grazing rights, and Dorothy shared her ideas for organizing the household accounts. After the meal, they cleaned up together, falling into a natural rhythm that surprised Dorothy with its ease. When the kitchen was tidy, Jake built up the fire in the main room against the evening chill. They sat in their usual chairs, but the atmosphere felt different now. They were husband and wife, no longer simply a man and woman making practical arrangements. Jake cleared his throat. "Dorothy, about tonight." He looked uncomfortable but determined. "I want you to know I don't expect. That is, I understand if you need time to." Dorothy felt both touched by his consideration and mortified at having to discuss such intimate matters directly. "I understand my duties as a wife, Jake," she said quietly, cheeks burning. "I made vows today that I intend to honor." Jake's expression was serious as he met her gaze. "Marriage is more than duty. I won't have you feeling obligated." The sentiment surprised and moved her. How many men would be so considerate of a mail-order bride's feelings? "Thank you for your concern, but I entered this marriage willingly with full understanding of what it entailed." Jake studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "As long as you're sure." Later, in the bedroom they would now share, Jake had moved her things while they were in town. The previous day Dorothy changed into her nightgown behind a screen while Jake politely turned his back. When she emerged, he was still dressed except for his boots and vest. "I'll just step out while you finish preparing," she offered, moving toward the door. "No need," Jake said. "I'll change after you're settled." Dorothy slipped into the bed larger than her previous one with a newer mattress and turned to face the wall, giving Jake privacy. She heard the rustle of clothing, then felt the mattress dip as he joined her, keeping a respectful distance between them. For several minutes they lay in silence, the only sound their breathing and the distant call of a coyote. Dorothy's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Jake must hear it. "Dorothy," Jake said finally, his voice low in the darkness, "are you afraid of me?" The question surprised her. "No," she answered honestly. "I'm not afraid of you, Jake." "Good." He was quiet for another moment. "I want you to know something. I'll never hurt you or force you. That's not the kind of man I am." Dorothy turned to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. "I know that, Jake. I wouldn't have married you if I thought otherwise." Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek gently. I want this marriage to work. For both of us. So do I, Dorothy whispered when he kissed her. It was gentle at first, questioning. Dorothy responded hesitantly, then with growing confidence as something warm and unexpected bloomed within her. Jake's touch remained gentle, considerate as he gradually drew her closer. What followed was not the duty Dorothy had braced herself for, but something far more tender than she had expected. Jake was patient, attentive to her responses, putting her comfort before his own pleasure. When they finally lay together as husband and wife, Dorothy felt not used or diminished, but strangely empowered and connected to this quiet, complicated man who was now her husband. Afterward, as they lay side by side, Jake's arm a warm weight across her waist, Dorothy found herself hoping that perhaps, in time, their practical arrangement might grow into something more. The days turned to weeks as Dorothy settled into life as Mrs. Forrester. Each day brought new challenges and lessons as she learned to manage a ranch household, so different from her Boston upbringing. She mastered the temperamental wood stove, learned to make soap and candles under Mrs. Pearson's tutelage, and even began riding out with Jake occasionally to check on the cattle. Jake proved to be a patient teacher and a considerate husband. He never criticized Dorothy's early failures like the first loaf of bread that emerged from the oven hard as a rock, or the time she accidentally let the fire go out completely and had to restart it from scratch. Instead, he simply showed her a better technique or, when he didn't know himself, arranged for Mrs. Pearson to demonstrate. Their physical relationship developed slowly but steadily, growing from the initial awkwardness to a comfortable intimacy that sometimes surprised Dorothy with its intensity. Jake was always attentive to her needs, never treating her as merely a convenience. In the darkness of their bedroom, he revealed a tenderness that he rarely showed in daylight. During the day, Jake worked long hours with the cattle or making improvements to the ranch, often returning exhausted but satisfied. Dorothy took over the household accounts, as promised, organizing Jake's haphazard record, keeping into a systematic ledger that clearly showed the ranch's financial position. Jake was impressed by her skill with numbers, and they began discussing ranch decisions together, with Dorothy offering perspectives Jake sometimes overlooked. As summer turned to autumn, Dorothy realized with some surprise that she was happy. Not in the giddy, romantic way of penny novels, but in a deep, settled way she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. She had purpose, security, and the respect of her husband more than she had dared hope for when she boarded that stagecoach in Boston. One cool October evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Jake watching Dorothy mend one of his shirts, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Are you content here, Dorothy?" She looked up from her sewing, studying his serious expression. "Yes, I am. Why do you ask?" Jake poked at the fire, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "Just wondering if you miss city life, books and theaters and such." Dorothy set her sewing aside. "I miss certain aspects of Boston, the libraries perhaps, and occasionally the concerts. But I don't miss the constraints or the pretensions." She smiled slightly. "And we have books here. I've been enjoying your collection." Jake nodded, still focused on the fire. "Could get more. Next time I'm in Denver or order them." The offer touched her. "That would be lovely." "But I'm not unhappy, Jake. Please don't think that." He finally looked at her directly. "Good, want you to be happy here." Something in his tone made Dorothy's heart beat faster. "I am, are you, happy with our arrangement?" A smile ghosted across Jake's features. "More than I expected to be." The simple admission warmed Dorothy more than the fire before them. They weren't declarations of undying love, but from Jake, these quiet words held significant meaning, As autumn progressed, Dorothy began preparing for her first winter in Colorado. Mrs. Pearson helped her preserve the last of the garden's harvest, teaching her to pickle vegetables and make jam from late berries. They smoked meat and stored root vegetables in the cool cellar beneath the house. Jake brought home a deer he'd shot, and Dorothy learned to process every part of it, wasting nothing. "Winter hits hard up here," Jake warned as they worked together to split and stack firewood. "Can get snowed in for days, sometimes weeks." Dorothy wiped sweat from her brow, unused to such physical labor but finding unexpected satisfaction in it. "I'll make sure we're prepared." Jake paused in his chopping to look at her flushed and dusty, her sleeves rolled up as she carried armloads of split wood to the growing pile by the house. Something like admiration flashed in his eyes. "You've taken to ranch life better than I expected." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Forrester?" Dorothy teased, growing more comfortable with such exchanges as their relationship deepened. "Just an observation, Mrs. Forrester," Jake replied, but his eyes held warmth. The first snow came in early November, transforming the landscape overnight. Dorothy woke to find the world outside their window blanketed in white, the familiar shapes of the ranch rendered new and magical under the pristine covering. "It's beautiful," she breathed, standing at the window in her nightgown. Jake came up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "First snow's always pretty. Less so by February when you're sick of being cooped up." Dorothy leaned back slightly into his solid presence. "Then we'll need to find ways to stay occupied indoors," she said, surprising herself with the hint of flirtation in her tone. Jake's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "I'm sure we can think of something," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. The snow didn't last, it melted within days, but it was a harbinger of the winter to come. Jake and Hank worked tirelessly to ensure the cattle had access to fodder and water, while Dorothy finished preparations in the house, making sure they had ample supplies to weather potential storms. In late November, Dorothy began feeling unwell in the mornings. At first, she dismissed it as a passing illness, but after a week of consistent symptoms, she confided in Mrs. Pearson. The older woman's eyes lit up. "How long since your monthly time, child?" Dorothy calculated quickly, then felt a rush of both excitement and trepidation. "Almost 2 months, you think?" Mrs. Pearson nodded, smiling broadly. "I'd say you're increasing, Mrs. Forrester. Should have the doctor confirm when he's next through town, but all the signs are there. A baby." Dorothy placed a hand on her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by the possibility. She and Jake hadn't discussed children specifically, beyond her mention of hoping for them someday. Someday had arrived sooner than expected. That evening, after a simple supper of venison stew and cornbread, Dorothy gathered her courage as they sat by the fire. "Jake, I have something to tell you," she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He looked up from the bridle he was repairing, his expression immediately concerned. "Something wrong?" "No, not wrong." Dorothy took a deep breath. "I believe I'm expecting a child, in late spring if my calculations are correct." Jake went very still, the bridle forgotten in his hands. For a long moment he said nothing, and Dorothy felt a flutter of anxiety. What if he wasn't ready for fatherhood? What if this complicated their still developing relationship? Then Jake set the bridle aside and crossed to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "A child?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. Dorothy nodded, searching his face. "Mrs. Pearson thinks so. All the signs are there." A slow smile spread across Jake's face, the most unguarded expression Dorothy had ever seen from him. "A child," he repeated, this time with wonder. His hand moved hesitantly to hover over her stomach. "Our child." "Yes," Dorothy whispered, tears pricking her eyes at his evident joy. "Our child." Jake's hand settled gently on her abdomen. "I'll build a cradle," he said, already planning. "And we'll need to expand the bedroom, add a nursery, before spring." His eyes met hers, full of emotion. "Are you happy about this, Dorothy?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I hadn't expected it so soon, but yes, I'm very happy." Jake rose to his feet, pulling Dorothy up with him, and in a surprising gesture wrapped his arms around her in a tight embrace. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" she asked, leaning into his strength. "For answering my advertisement, for coming all this way, for—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "For giving me a family again." Dorothy's heart swelled with emotion. This wasn't the passionate love she'd once dreamed of as a girl, but it was something equally powerful, a deep bond forged through shared purpose and growing affection. Perhaps, she thought, this was what real love looked like, built day by day through mutual respect and care, rather than sudden passion. The first major snowstorm hit in December, confining them to the house for 3 days. Jake had prepared well, bringing extra firewood inside before the storm hit and ensuring the livestock had shelter and feed. They passed the time in companionable activities, Jake working on the promised cradle while Dorothy sewed small garments for the baby and read aloud from one of their books. In the evenings, Jake would often place his hand on Dorothy's still flat stomach, as if trying to connect with the tiny life growing within. Sometimes he would talk to the baby, telling simple stories about the ranch or his plans for teaching their child to ride and rope when they were old enough. These tender moments revealed a side of Jake that Dorothy suspected few others ever saw. As Christmas approached, Dorothy felt a twinge of homesickness for the traditions she'd grown up with in Boston, the carolers in the streets, the elaborate decorations in shop windows, the special services at church. Jake noticed her melancholy one evening as she stared out at the snow-covered landscape. "Missing home?" he asked quietly, joining her at the window. Dorothy smiled faintly. "Just remembering Christmases past. We had certain traditions in my family." Jake was silent for a moment. "What kind of traditions?" Dorothy told him about decorating a tree with candles and ornaments, hanging stockings by the fireplace, singing carols around the piano, and attending midnight church service on Christmas Eve. As she spoke, Jake listened attentively, as he always did when she shared parts of her past. On December 23rd, Jake left early in the morning without explanation, saying only that he had errands to run and would return by evening. Dorothy spent the day cleaning the house and preparing food for the holiday, wondering at Jake's mysterious absence, but trusting he had his reasons. When he returned just after sunset, he carried several bundles and wore a satisfied expression despite the cold. "Got some things in town," he explained, shaking snow from his coat. "For Christmas." Together they unwrapped his purchases, a small pine tree that could sit on a table, candles to decorate it, and simple gifts. A new woolen shawl for Dorothy, a carved wooden horse for the baby, and ingredients for a special Christmas meal. "Jake," Dorothy said, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to do all this." "Wanted to," he replied simply. "Thought we could start our own traditions, combine yours with new ones." That evening they decorated the small tree together, and Dorothy taught Jake the Christmas carols she remembered from childhood. His deep voice was untrained but pleasant as they sang by firelight. It wasn't the elaborate celebration of her Boston days, but somehow it felt more meaningful, this simple, heartfelt effort to create something special together. On Christmas morning, Dorothy woke to find Jake already up, the fire blazing cheerfully and coffee brewing on the stove. He'd filled the stocking he'd hung for her with small treats, peppermint sticks, an orange, a tiny bottle of lavender water, and a pair of warm mittens he'd apparently asked Mrs. Pearson to knit. "Merry Christmas, Dorothy," he said, watching her discover each item with evident pleasure in her reaction. "Merry Christmas, Jake." She handed him a package containing a book she'd ordered secretly through Mr. Jenkins at the general store, a collection of Western tales she thought he'd enjoy. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Jake interrupted, turning the book in his hands with appreciation. "Been a while since I had something new to read." They spent the day in quiet celebration, enjoying a special meal and reading by the fire. When evening came, Jake surprised her again by suggesting they bundle up and step outside. "Want to show you something," he explained, helping her into her coat and new shawl. Outside, the night was clear and cold, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Jake led Dorothy a short distance from the house, then stopped and pointed upward. "City lights make it hard to see them properly," he said. "Stars, I mean. Out here you can see everything." Dorothy gazed upward, awestruck by the celestial display. The Milky Way stretched across the sky in a glittering band, and stars of every brightness twinkled against the darkness. "It's magnificent," she breathed, her words forming clouds in the cold air. Jake's arm slipped around her waist. "Worth coming west for?" he asked, a note of vulnerability in his question that Dorothy rarely heard. She leaned into him, drawing warmth from his solid presence. "Yes," she said with complete honesty, "this and many other things." Jake turned to face her, his expression serious in the starlight. "Dorothy, I need to tell you something. Should have said it before now, probably." Her heart quickened. "What is it?" Jake seemed to struggle with words, unusual for a man who, while quiet, was generally direct. "When I wrote that advertisement, I was just looking for a practical arrangement. Someone to keep house, maybe provide companionship. Didn't expect." He paused, looking at her intently. "Didn't expect to feel this way." "What way?" Dorothy whispered, hardly daring to hope. Jake's hand came up to touch her cheek gently. "Like I'd be lost if you weren't here. Like everything's better with you around." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Dorothy, probably have for a while now. Just took me time to recognize it." Tears sprang to Dorothy's eyes, freezing instantly in the cold air. "Oh, Jake." Concern crossed his face. "I've upset you. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No," Dorothy interrupted, placing her fingers against his lips. "I'm crying because I'm happy. Because I love you too, and I never thought." She swallowed hard. "I never thought I'd be loved again after my parents died. I came west hoping for security, for a decent arrangement with a man who wouldn't mistreat me. I never dared hope for love." Jake's arms tightened around her. "You've been loved all along," he said softly. "From the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, looking so brave and determined despite being exhausted and afraid. Just took me a while to recognize it for what it was." Dorothy reached up to touch his face, marveling at this taciturn man who had just given her the most beautiful words she'd ever heard. "I love you, Jake Forrester." When he kissed her beneath the winter stars, Dorothy felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she left Boston as a mail-order bride, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have dreamed. Spring came to Willow Creek in a rush of melting snow and new growth. The creek swelled with runoff from the mountains, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the pastures. Dorothy, now visibly pregnant, found herself full of energy after the long winter, eager to plant a garden and prepare for the baby's arrival. Jake had been true to his word, adding a small nursery adjoining their bedroom during the winter months. He'd crafted not only a cradle but also a small chest for baby clothes and a rocking chair where Dorothy could nurse. The furniture was simple but beautifully made, evidence of both his skill and his love for their coming child. On a warm May morning, with the scent of fresh earth and new grass filling the air, Dorothy felt the first pains. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, enjoying the sunshine after so many months indoors, when the initial cramp seized her. She paused, one of Jake's shirts in her hands, waiting to see if it would pass. When another pain followed 20 minutes later, she knew. The baby was coming, perhaps a bit earlier than expected, but not dangerously so. Dorothy finished hanging the laundry, then made her way inside to prepare. Jake was out with the cattle and wouldn't return until evening unless she sent for him. Dorothy debated whether to do so immediately, but decided to wait. First babies often took their time, Mrs. Pearson had told her, and there was no sense in alarming Jake prematurely. She spent the next few hours making practical preparations, boiling water, laying out clean linens, and sending the young boy who helped with farm chores to fetch Mrs. Pearson from town. By the time the older woman arrived, Dorothy's pains were coming regularly, though still far apart. "You're doing just fine," Mrs. Pearson assured her after an examination. "Baby's positioned well, might be several hours yet, though." "Should we send for Jake?" Dorothy asked, breathing through another contraction. Mrs. Pearson considered. "Let's wait a bit longer. No sense having him pace the floor for hours if we can help it. Men are useless at these times anyway." As the afternoon wore on, Dorothy's labor intensified. Mrs. Pearson helped her walk around the house between contractions, then supported her through each wave of pain. By late afternoon, when the contractions were coming hard and fast, Mrs. Pearson finally sent the farm boy to find Jake. "Tell him it's time," she instructed. "But don't you dare say anything to frighten him, mind. Just that the baby's coming and all is proceeding normally." Jake arrived an hour later, his horse lathered from hard riding. He burst through the door, his face a mask of concern. "Dorothy," he called. "In here," Mrs. Pearson answered from the bedroom. "She's doing fine, just getting close now." Jake appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking simultaneously terrified and determined. When he saw Dorothy, propped up on pillows and breathing heavily through a contraction, he moved immediately to her side. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand. "What do you need?" Dorothy managed a smile despite her exhaustion. "Just stay with me," Jake nodded, pulling a chair close to the bed. He held her hand through each contraction, speaking softly words of encouragement and love. When the pains became almost unbearable and Dorothy cried out, he looked stricken but never wavered in his support. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her. "You can do this." As sunset painted the sky outside their window, Dorothy gave a final tremendous push, and their child entered the world with a lusty cry. Mrs. Pearson worked quickly, cleaning and checking the infant before placing the small bundle in Dorothy's arms. "You have a daughter," she announced, beaming. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Dorothy gazed down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed with love and wonder. "Jake, look at her. She's perfect." Jake leaned close, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration as he stared at their daughter. "She is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. One large finger gently touched the baby's cheek. "She has your nose, I think." "And your eyes," Dorothy said, noting the distinctly blue color. What shall we call her? They had discussed names during the winter but hadn't settled on any. Now, looking at their daughter's determined little face, Jake said softly, "What about Hope? Seems fitting." Dorothy smiled, tears of joy blurring her vision. "Hope, yes, that's perfect." She looked up at Jake. "Hope Forrester, Mrs. Pearson efficiently completed the necessary tasks, helping Dorothy clean up and settle comfortably, before tactfully withdrawing to the kitchen to prepare food. leaving the new family alone together. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Dorothy's shoulders, the other gently cradling his daughter's tiny hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "For her, for everything." Dorothy leaned against him, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "Who would have thought when I stepped off that stagecoach that this is where we'd end up?" Jake pressed a kiss to her temple. "I think maybe a part of me knew even then. Something about you felt right from the first moment." He looked down at their daughter, now sleeping peacefully in Dorothy's arms. "Like you belonged here, I do belong here," Dorothy said with conviction. "With you, with hope, this is home." Outside, the western sky blazed with the colors of sunset, casting a golden glow through their window. Inside, the small family created through chance, necessity, and ultimately love began their life together. Proof that sometimes the most unpromising beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. 5 years later, Dorothy stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Jake taught Hope to ride her very first pony, a gentle creature he'd raised specifically for their daughter. At 7 years old, Hope was a perfect blend of her parents. She had Jake's blue eyes and determined nature, combined with Dorothy's light brown hair and quick mind. Beside Dorothy, 2-year-old James played with wooden blocks, occasionally demanding his mother's attention with excited babbles about his creations. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Jake's hard work and Dorothy's careful management of their finances had allowed them to increase their herd and add to their land holdings. The house now boasted a proper parlor, another bedroom, and a study where Dorothy maintained their accounts and correspondence, including regular letters to several friends she'd made in town. Life wasn't always easy. Droughts, harsh winters, and the occasional illness tested them, but they faced each challenge together, their partnership stronger for the love that had grown between them. Jake remained a man of few words in public, but with Dorothy and their children, he showed a warmth and tenderness that would have surprised those who knew only his stoic exterior. As Hope successfully guided her pony in a small circle, Jake looked up at the porch, his face breaking into a proud smile. Even now, that smile could make Dorothy's heart skip a beat. She waved and he gestured for her to join them. "Mama, look," Hope called. "I'm riding by myself." Dorothy descended the porch steps, carrying James on her hip. "I see. You're doing wonderfully, darling." Jake came to take James, settling the boy on his broad shoulders where he squealed in delight. "She's a natural," he said, his eyes bright with pride. "Like her mother," Dorothy laughed. "I think you're remembering my first riding lessons too kindly. I nearly fell off at every step. But you got back on every time," Jake reminded her. "That's what matters." They stood together, watching Hope circle the corral, their small family complete and contented in the home they'd built together. Dorothy thought back to that uncertain young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 5 years ago, hoping only for security and respectful treatment. How little she had known of what awaited her, not just a practical arrangement but deep love, children, and a true partnership. Jake's free arm slipped around her waist, and he pressed a kiss to her temple, a gesture that had become familiar but never lost its meaning. "Happy?" he asked softly. Dorothy leaned into his strength, smiling up at the man who had become so much more than just her husband. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "And you?" Jake's eyes, as blue and clear as the Colorado sky above them, held nothing but love as he looked at her. "More than I ever thought possible," he said. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed, Dorothy." "And you gave me everything I never dared hope for," she replied. "A true home, love, family." As the western sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Dorothy Forrester counted her blessings the mail-order bride, who had found not just security but profound love in the arms of her quiet rancher, the woman who had been loved all along.